Have you ever wondered how one simple action can change everything? Picture this: a hero in uniform, just back from a mission, sits down in his well-deserved seat in first class, but suddenly a woman refuses to give him her seat, deciding that he does not belong there. But what she does not know is who is standing behind her, watching what is happening. Where are you watching this video from now? Write in the comments. It's always interesting to know how such stories unite people around the world. It's a situation like this that makes us wonder, why in today's world are there still moments when people are judged by their appearance, skin color, or social status? Unfortunately, racism is a problem that many continue to face, even in the most unexpected places. In this case, the woman, knowing nothing about the man in front of her, immediately concluded that he was not worthy of being in first grade. But what made her think that way? Perhaps it's the stereotypes that are ingrained in our society. People in uniform, especially if they are black, are supposedly not entitled to the privileges that she believes are reserved for other people. This situation is just one example of how racism manifests itself in everyday life, and how misjudgments can affect relationships between people. But this story is not only about injustice, because what happened next shows that there are always those who see beyond prejudice. The observer standing behind this woman is ready to intervene and turn this awkward and unpleasant situation into a moment that will be remembered forever as a lesson for all of us. But who is this person? What is his role in this story? Every time we see such incidents, we are reminded that racism is not only overt hostility, it can manifest itself in subtle, everyday gestures, as it did here in one of the most privileged places in the world, first class on an airplane. And every time we see such moments, we have a choice: to turn a blind eye and allow the injustice to continue, or to stand up and defend the person who has been subjected to unfounded accusations and discrimination. The silence in the plane was deafening. The tension grew as the woman continued to insist that a black soldier couldn't be in first class. Her gaze was full of displeasure and superiority, and despite the obvious embarrassment of those around her, she stood firm. The soldier stood silently, holding back his emotions. His face betrayed the internal struggle, the sense of injustice and disappointment that had been too often a part of his life. Over the years, he had become accustomed to being judged not by his merits, but by the color of his skin. Racism isn't just words or insults. It's a way of looking at the world where people are judged by their appearance rather than their actions. It's an invisible wall that divides society, leaving people feeling excluded and unfair. The woman on the plane didn't say anything directly about race, but her actions spoke louder than words. This is a typical case of what's called hidden racism, where discrimination is not expressed through aggression, but through the assumption that a person doesn't have the right to equal treatment. For the soldier, this was a familiar moment. He had experienced similar things outside of his military service, but each time it hurt. He had served his country, defended it, risked his life, and yet even in his uniform he could not escape the prejudices. It was a reminder that neither uniform nor medals could protect him from the reality that he was judged by his appearance. But what the woman didn't know was that behind her stood a man who could change the course of this situation. He was a senior officer, commanding the soldiers' unit. He saw everything and, most importantly, understood everything. The officer knew that the intervention should not be just an act of defense, it should be a lesson for all witnesses of this scene. He approached the woman and spoke quietly but firmly, not raising his voice but making it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. He told her that the soldier before her was not just a man in uniform, but a hero who had earned his place in first class by fighting for his country. The officer reminded her that no seat on the plane, no status, gave her the right to humiliate or judge another person. His words were harsh but heartfelt. They carried with them a condemnation not only of her actions, but also of the deep injustices that permeated society. The woman froze, stunned and ashamed. Her expression changed from arrogant to confused. She hadn't expected anyone to intervene, and so decisively. Her gaze darted between the officer and the soldier, and only now did it begin to dawn on her how unfair her actions had been. The soldier, however, remained standing, his head raised, but without malice. He had seen this many times, but today was different. Today he was protected not because he asked for it, but because someone decided that justice demanded it. He was grateful, but what struck him most was that a man who cared about the fate of his subordinates had intervened. This story is not just about a soldier and a woman. It is about how deeply prejudice runs in the minds of some people, even in moments when society seems to be moving toward equality. Incidents like these remind us that the fight against racism continues every day, in small and large ways. It is a fight for respect, for the right to be judged not by your appearance but by your actions, for the opportunity to live in a world where no one judges you just because you were born with a different skin color. But the most important thing in this story is the reaction of those around him. The officer who decided to speak out became an example of how you can change the situation when you stand on the side of truth. His intervention was not just support for the soldier, but also a challenge for everyone who witnessed this incident. He showed that racism should not go unnoticed, that every person, regardless of position, can stand up and protect someone who is being subjected to injustice. It's moments like these that change your thinking. The people on the plane who witnessed this scene walked away with the thought that the world needs to change, and that change starts with us. And maybe the next time someone experiences similar injustice, they'll remember the story and take a step toward justice. The silence in the plane's cabin grew more and more tense, as if the air were charged with electricity. The woman, still standing next to the soldier, was not going to back down. Her eyes were flashing, and in her every movement one could sense the unwavering confidence in her own rightness. She clearly believed that she had the right to dictate who should sit in first class and who should not. The soldier stood still, like a statue, holding back the storm of emotions that boiled inside him. He had no intention of engaging in conflict, but his heart was beating faster with each passing second. Years of service, countless dangerous missions, losses and hardships of army life, all of it had hardened his body and spirit. But what cut deepest were moments like these, when his merits and sacrifices were devalued simply because of the color of his skin. Once again, he had to face the reality that his worth was being called into question. Then, out of the blue, one of the passengers broke the silence. A young woman sitting in one of the rows stood up and said loudly, "What's going on? Why won't you let him take his seat?" There was a mixture of bewilderment and indignation in her voice. Her eyes were full of sympathy, and she was clearly ready to support the soldier. The question seemed to clear the air, but only for a moment. The woman who had refused her a seat turned sharply on her, her lips pressed together. "He shouldn't be here. These seats are for those who can afford them." Her voice was as cold as ice. The words hung in the air like an accusation, like a sentence, and everyone in the salon knew that this wasn't about money. It was the hidden racism that suffused her words like poison. The soldier looked at the floor, clenching his fists. He knew he could argue. He could say that this was his place, that he had paid for it like everyone else. But that wasn't what hurt him most. What hurt him most was that after all he had done for his country, he still had to prove his right to respect. The young woman, however, did not back down. "Do you know who he is?" She raised her voice, addressing the passengers. "This man risked his life to protect our country. He deserves more respect than any of us. He is a hero." At this point, a murmur arose in the cabin. Several people began to express solidarity, casting glances in the direction of the woman who was trying to stop the soldier. Some looked at her with condemnation, while others simply watched in silence, unsure of how to react to the situation. The woman frowned, her face reddened with anger, but something in her gaze changed. Apparently, she felt that the situation was getting out of her control. However, instead of admitting her mistake, she suddenly shouted sharply, "Maybe it's his problem that he chose this life. If he worked like a normal person, he wouldn't have to wear this uniform." The words cut through the air like a sharp knife. It wasn't just a jab at the soldier, it was an insult to everything he stood for. The soldier clenched his fists tighter. His face remained impassive, but something inside him broke. He had always known he was dealing with bias, but he had never imagined it would go this far, to the point of disregard for his service and sacrifice. But then something unexpected happened. A calm but powerful voice came from behind the woman. "I think you should apologize." It was the same officer who had been silently observing the situation all this time. He was not one to stir up conflicts, but this moment required his intervention. His gaze was firm, and there was a steely determination in his voice. Everyone froze. The woman turned sharply toward him, her face pale. He was in uniform, but he wore medals and insignia that indicated higher rank. She realized she had made a huge mistake. The officer came closer and addressed her. "This man is my subordinate. He has earned not only his place in first class, but also our collective respect. He fought to protect you and your freedom, so that you could live in safety, and you humiliated him in front of all these people." The woman tried to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. The officer continued, "Your actions are not just disrespectful to him personally. It is disrespectful to everyone who wears the uniform, to everyone who sacrificed their lives for you." The officer's words hit her like a hammer. She slowly lowered her eyes, realizing that she could say nothing more in her defense. Meanwhile, the soldier remained where he was, gritting his teeth, but inside he felt relief. This officer, his commander, had become his protector in this difficult moment. He was not alone, and although he was used to dealing with such situations on his own, this time someone else had decided to stand up for justice. The woman seemed to have accepted that her position no longer made sense. She slowly stepped aside, allowing the soldier to take his rightful place. She no longer dared to look up, her earlier confidence gone. Perhaps she had realized her mistake. Perhaps she would carry this lesson with her for the rest of her life. The soldier sat down, and the officer stood next to him, placing his hand on his shoulder. They did not exchange words, but they did not need to. The gesture said more than any words. As the soldier sat down, he felt the tension slowly recede. There was a strange silence around him, mixed with a vague sense of relief. He looked at the officer who was still standing next to him and saw how his gaze filled with respect and gratitude. It was a moment when no words were needed. Everything had already been said and done. Gradually, the passengers began to return to their usual activities, but this incident did not leave them indifferent. Each of them, perhaps, interpreted what happened in their own way. For some, it was a simple scene from life. For others, an important lesson that they will take with them. The woman who had caused all this conflict finally left first class and was not seen again. The passengers who remained began exchanging glances and whispering. Some, of course, tried to forget what had happened, but for many, this incident became something that made them reconsider their own views on fairness and equality. The soldier remained in his chair, deep in thought. He was grateful for the officer's support, but it did not ease the pain he felt from his humiliation. He looked out the window, watching the clouds slowly drift past. He thought about how life in the army was not only about service and obedience, but also a constant struggle for respect, both inside and outside of it. The officer, noticing the soldier's condition, sat down next to him. He was slow to offer words of comfort, preferring to give the soldier time to recover. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle and respectful. "This was a difficult moment, but I wanted you to know that I am proud of what you did. Your actions today showed strength and dignity." The soldier nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude rise up inside him. "Thank you, sir. I didn't know how it would end." It was a reminder that, despite all our efforts, we still have to fight against bias and racism. The officer took a deep breath. "Yes, sometimes it feels like we're taking a step forward and then we hit another obstacle, but it's at times like these that it's important to remember that we're not alone. We support each other, and that gives us strength." The soldier thought about his words. Although this incident was painful, he knew that he should not let situations like this define his life. He knew that every encounter like this was a chance to show that he was more than what was being forced upon him. As the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, the soldier felt that this day would leave an indelible mark on his memory. The officer walked him to the exit and they exchanged a few words of farewell. The soldier felt that at least one person in this world truly understood his struggle. This day, filled with drama and trials, became a lesson for the soldier about the importance of support and solidarity. He knew that there were more trials ahead, but now he had the confidence that there were people in his life who were ready to stand up for him, and this gave him strength, allowing him to move forward despite all the difficulties. As he left the airport and walked toward his home, the soldier felt a little stronger and wiser. He had not forgotten the pain and humiliation, but he knew now that these experiences only made him more resilient and determined. A hope was born in his heart that every step toward justice, every action in defense of truth and dignity, was a step toward a world in which bias and racism would be just part of the history left behind. When the soldier returned home, he hoped that the incident on the plane would be behind him and would no longer haunt his thoughts. However, life had another unexpected turn in store for him. A few days later, he found his name in the news. For the first time, he saw his case in the headlines: "Soldier in first class, racism problem on airline." At first, he was surprised that the story had received so much publicity. Many people began to discuss the incident, and opinions were divided. Some expressed support for the soldier, while others, including those on the woman's side, believed that it was an inappropriate intervention, not racism. One day, while browsing online comments, the soldier came across a message from a stranger who wrote, "You don't know the whole truth. The woman on the plane was my mother. We have our reasons." These words immediately caught his attention. The soldier decided to reply, and soon he began corresponding with this person. He learned that the woman who had caused the conflict was indeed from a family that had long been facing financial difficulties. They had long struggled to stay afloat, and her bias was rooted in fear and insecurity that even small privileges, such as a seat in first class, were out of their reach. This unexpected turn of events forced the soldier to look at the situation from a new perspective. At first he was filled with indignation, but soon he began to understand that behind the aggression and arrogance there could be deep personal pain. The soldier also learned that the woman had lost her husband in the recent financial crisis, and her anger may have been fueled not only by prejudice but also by feelings of insecurity and fear for the future. Inspired by this new understanding, the soldier decided to meet the man to discuss the situation face to face. He arranged to meet the woman's son at a cafe where they could talk in a calm environment. At the meeting, they began a conversation in which they each opened up about their experiences and feelings. The soldier spoke about his experience, how it was hard for him to feel humiliated despite his achievements. He explained that his service was not only about protecting the country, but also about the pursuit of justice. The woman's son, in turn, shared his family's story and how they tried to cope with difficulties, which sometimes led to actions based on fear and mistrust. They soon began to realize that they had much in common. Despite the differences in their experiences, they realized that in both suffering and fear, there were commonalities that united people rather than divided them. Following this encounter, the soldier and the woman's family began working to create a program to support low-income families, reduce prejudice, and provide opportunities for better lives. They wanted to use their experiences to create a more just society, where prejudice and fear did not divide people. Their story took on new meaning when they came together for a common goal: to fight racism and bias. The soldier, who had previously suffered humiliation, now felt that his fight for justice had taken on new meaning. He found not only support, but also an opportunity to change the situation, turning it into something constructive and meaningful. This unexpected turn in his life showed that even the most difficult and painful situations can lead to something good if approached with an open heart and a willingness to understand the other person. The story of the soldier and the woman's family became a symbol of how even deeply rooted prejudices can be overcome through understanding and joint efforts. They began working with the soldier and the woman's family on a support and inclusion program aimed at reducing bias and creating opportunities for those facing challenges. They developed educational initiatives that included racial equity workshops and personal development training for families in need. Their goal was not only to provide material assistance, but also to create an environment where people could openly discuss their fears and biases. Over time, the program began to gain popularity and attract the attention of local and national media. Many people were touched by the personal story of the soldier and woman, and their fight for justice became an inspiration to others. At first, these were small successes, but then the program attracted significant resources and support from private organizations and government agencies. Despite the positive changes, the soldier and his new partner faced challenges. Some groups still resisted the changes, insisting that such initiatives only deepen divisions rather than addressing real problems. This opposition sometimes led to heated discussions and protests. The soldier and his team, however, continued their work, convinced that every story, every encounter, every change was a step toward greater understanding and peace. One day, during one of the program's events, A woman whose name he had heard in the news approached the soldier. She was one of those who had previously criticized the program, believing it to be ineffective. But this time, her expression was different, full of humility and sincerity. She admitted that her views had changed after she saw the real results of the program's work and heard the stories of people who had received support and changes in their lives. This encounter was a pivotal moment for the soldier. He understood that change does not happen overnight, and that overcoming bias takes time and patience. Actions, words, and deeds that seem insignificant can have profound consequences over time. It was in moments like these that he felt his work had meaning. One day, as part of the program, they organized an event that brought together people from different social classes, nationalities, and professions. It was a day of dialogue and storytelling, where everyone could tell their version of reality and share their experiences. On this day, a soldier gave a speech in which he spoke about the importance of honest dialogue and an open heart. "We all carry stories with us that shape us," he said, "but it's important to understand that our stories can intersect, and it's in that intersection that we can find common ground and understanding." The event attracted a lot of attention and became an important stage in the program's work. It showed that even the most difficult problems can be solved through openness and mutual respect. People began to realize that the fight against bias is not only a question of rights and privileges, but also of deep human kindness and understanding. Over time, the program, supported by the efforts of the soldier and the woman's family, expanded to a broader level and began to impact the community. New opportunities for discussion and learning were created, and people began to become more involved in changing public consciousness. The story of a soldier and a woman that began with a traumatic incident on a plane turned into an example of how personal struggles can inspire change in society. It showed that even in the darkest moments, light and hope can be found if there is a willingness to understand the other person and work together for the common good. The soldier continued to serve and participate in the program. Knowing that his work was not yet done, he knew that true change was gradual and required sustained effort. But now he had more confidence that his actions mattered and could make a difference in the world. So, his story continued to inspire many, and he felt that despite the difficulties and challenges, he had found his way in life, a way that helps build bridges between people, creating a more just and understanding world. Despite all the program's accomplishments, the shadow of tragedy never left the soldier's life alone. Months later, when it seemed the changes were beginning to bear real fruit, something happened that shook him to the core. In one of the cities where the program was active, an explosion occurred at a charity event organized as part of the program. The explosive device was hidden in a package delivered to the event and exploded during a public speech that a soldier was giving in support of the program. The tragedy killed several people, including volunteers, activists, and even children who came to the event with their parents. The soldier was one of the survivors. At the moment of the explosion, his body was thrown aside and he, although seriously injured, survived. He was found in a semi-conscious state, among the rubble and destruction, and was taken to the hospital with multiple wounds. This tragedy was a blow not only to the program, but also to the soldier personally. He felt responsible for what had happened. Every time he closed his eyes, images of those who had died and their relatives who had lost loved ones appeared before him. His pain was not only physical, but also emotional. One question was spinning in his head: how could he have allowed this to happen? Immediately after the tragedy, a large-scale investigation began to find out who was behind this act of violence. It turned out that the explosive device was organized by a radical group that opposed the ideas of the program and considered it a threat to their world. Their hatred was directed not only at the program, but also at everything it represented, the idea of equality and integration. The investigation continued for months, with each day bringing new, horrific details. Meanwhile, the soldier was in hospital, recovering from his wounds. He continued to suffer, dreaming of destruction and hearing the screams of victims. His mental state began to deteriorate, and he fell into depression. Guilt and fear became his constant companions. When the investigation was completed, the group of radicals was arrested, but this did not bring relief to the soldier. he realized that despite the arrests, the ideologies of hatred and prejudice still existed and could cause more suffering. The program was temporarily suspended to ensure the safety of the participants and to reorganize. It took several months for the soldier to return to normal life. He continued to work on restoring the program, but it was no longer the same. His former energy and enthusiasm had given way to doubts and fears. He felt that he had lost a part of himself in the tragedy and was now a different person, a person who had come face to face with the darkest side of human nature. One day, as the soldier sat in the park, wondering how to continue his work, a woman approached him, one of the victims of the explosion. She was in a wheelchair and could barely walk. Her eyes were full of stoicism and determination. She told the soldier that she had lost her son in the explosion, but that she had come not to blame him, but to say, "You cannot let this act of violence win. Your cause is important. We have lost much, but we cannot let hatred destroy what we have tried to build." Her words were like a breath of fresh air. Although the pain and loss remained in his heart, he felt obligated to continue his work. The memories of sacrifice and suffering remained with him, but they became his motivation for further action. The soldier restarted the program, now with even greater determination. He understood that the task of fighting prejudice and hatred had become more difficult and dangerous, but he knew that he could not allow these dark forces to win. Every day he fought his inner demons, but also external challenges, striving to make the world a better place despite all the challenges. The tragedy that pierced his life left an indelible mark, but it also strengthened his resolve to fight for justice. A spark of hope burned in his heart that despite all the dark moments, the light they were trying to bring to the world would not fade. And even in the shadow of tragedy, he continued to search for a path to a better future, where prejudice and hatred would be defeated, and humanity could finally find harmony and understanding. Gradually, the soldier returned to work on the program. Despite the deep personal trauma and the consequences of the tragedy, he continued to fight for his goal. The support from survivors who were able to perceive the terrible incident with courage and determination was a powerful incentive for his further work. One day, while the soldier was organizing a new event, he received a call from an anonymous source. The voice on the phone was nervous, almost frightened. "You don't know who I am, but I know who was behind that explosion," the voice said. "I can help you uncover the truth, but you must meet me in a strictly confidential location." Despite his fears, the soldier agreed to meet. He was determined to uncover who was behind the tragedy and to understand how to prevent similar events in the future. The meeting was scheduled in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, where darkness and silence reigned. When he arrived, he was met by a shadowy figure who quickly explained that he was involved with a radical group that had carried out the bombing. The man, who called himself Jacob, claimed that he had been an inside man in the group but had become disillusioned with their ideology and now wanted to end it. The explosion was just the beginning. Jacob began. "Your program was targeted because it brought attention to problems we'd rather not see. But I'll tell you, this isn't just revenge. It's part of a bigger plan." The soldier felt his heart beat faster. Jacob went on to describe a complex network of radical groups that use violence to create chaos and division in society. While most of the group focused on traditional methods of struggle, a few key figures were planning a series of bombings to cause public unrest and disrupt all efforts to create a more just society. "I can show you the evidence and the plans," Jacob continued, "but I need your trust. They will be looking for me to eliminate, and I cannot stay in this place much longer." As they began exchanging information, Jacob revealed that he had access to classified documents and plans of the group. These documents contained information about new targets and how radical elements planned to expand their influence. The soldier realized that this was information that could save lives and prevent further tragedies. He offered to help Jacob ensure his safety and arrange for the information to be passed on to law enforcement. But before they could finish their discussion, their meeting place was attacked by armed men, obviously from a radical group. Jacob was captured, and the soldier only managed to hide, watching as the group took his informant away. The situation left the soldier deeply confused. He knew he now had valuable information, but he also knew Jacob was in danger. Returning to normal life was impossible. He had to find a way to free Jacob and prevent further violence. the soldier reached out to trusted allies and law enforcement officials, passing on information about the radical groups and their plans. He also began his own investigation to find out where Jacob was being held and how he could be rescued. As the investigation continued, the soldier discovered an unexpected twist in the case. The group Jacob belonged to had connections to high-ranking members of society and even some politicians who were trying to use radical movements for their own ends. These connections created complex obstacles and made the soldier's job more difficult. After solving several puzzles and following a complex web of clues, the soldier was able to locate the location where Jacob was being held. He mounted a rescue operation that involved careful planning and coordination with law enforcement. The operation was a success, and Jacob was freed. He was deeply grateful to the soldier for saving him, but also acknowledged that their job was not yet done. They needed to expose the radical group's connections and prevent further violence. Together, they began to expose a complex network that spanned many levels of society. These actions led to the arrests of high-ranking officials and public condemnation of radical groups. Meanwhile, the soldier once again took up the task of rebuilding the program. Although his internal traumas and fears were still present, he found the strength to continue the fight for justice and equality. This experience taught him that even in the darkest moments there is hope, and that the fight for truth and justice requires courage, determination, and a willingness to overcome one's own fears. The story of the soldier, Jacob, and their shared struggle against radical ideologies became a powerful symbol of resilience and the strength of the human spirit. Although they faced tragedies and threats, they showed that through determination and united effort, evil can be resisted and a world can be created where justice and humanity prevail. Following Jacob's successful release and exposure of his radical connections, the soldier and his allies began to shape public consciousness for a new wave of change. The program, despite its troubled past, was reborn with renewed vigor. The focus was on preventing radicalization and combating systemic bias at all levels of society. But before the soldier and his team could fully focus on recovery, another unexpected turn of events awaited them. One evening, while the soldier was working in his office phone rang. A strange number appeared on the screen, and the soldier, feeling slightly uneasy, answered. On the other end of the line was a voice he had heard before, the voice of one of the radical leaders arrested after being exposed. "Soldier," the voice said, "do you think we've stopped? You and your friends have just opened Pandora's box. What we've planned is far from finished. We won't stop until we've destroyed everything you've built." These words planted seeds of fear and anxiety in the soldier's heart. Despite all his efforts, it seemed that radical groups still had plans that threatened not only his work, but also the safety of many people. He knew that this threat could not be ignored. Without wasting any time, the soldier contacted his allies and law enforcement. They began working hard to protect the program and its employees. Additional security measures were taken, and every step of the program was now closely monitored. However, the anxiety and fear sown by the threat did not leave the soldier. His nights became full of anxiety and fearful thoughts about possible new attacks. Despite this, he continued his work, trying to keep himself in shape and focus on the mission. One day, when he was returning home after a long day at work, he noticed something strange. His apartment was in complete disarray. Clearly, someone had ransacked it. The table, books, personal belongings were scattered about, but fortunately, nothing had been stolen. He immediately realized that this was an act of intimidation. He did not know what the purpose of this action was, but he understood that his life and work were at risk. He and his team installed additional security measures in his apartment and at work, but that was just the beginning. Soon, new threats and attacks began to be reported at other parts of the program. These attacks, although they did not cause casualties, created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Jacob, who had successfully rehabilitated himself after his arrest, offered to help uncover deeper layers of radical connections. He provided new information that pointed to the alleged brain center of the radical network. This person may have been based outside the country and was one of the main manipulators behind the attacks. The soldier and his team began an international collaboration to track the man's movements and try to catch him before he could strike again. It was a complex and resource-intensive process, but they were determined to stop the threat. During this time, the soldier faced another tragedy. One of his close friends, who was actively involved in the program, was seriously injured in yet another attack. It was incredibly difficult for the soldier to see his loved one suffer because of his work. It only made him more determined to end this fight. As the investigation continued, the soldier and his team received unexpected information. The radical network was planning a mass act of violence that would take place at a major public event held to celebrate the program's anniversary. This was the last and largest attack they had planned. The soldier and his allies combined all their efforts to prevent a disaster. Every moment was precious and they worked 24/7 to ensure the safety of the event and prevent an attack. On the day of the event, when everything seemed under control, the soldier felt both excited and anxious. He knew that everything they did could be tested. And then, when the event began, his worst fears began to come true. Evidence of preparations for an attack was discovered. However, due to careful preparation and coordination with law enforcement, the attack was prevented. The soldier and his team were able to neutralize the threat before it could become a reality. It was a decisive moment. Despite the many hardships they had endured, the soldier and his allies could breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that they had prevented another bloodbath. With the events that had transpired, the soldier realized that the fight for justice and equality does not end with one victory. Each step forward requires constant attention and readiness for new challenges. But despite the tragedies and difficulties he had experienced, he continued to believe that their efforts would lead to a better future. And even when darkness would come again, they would continue to fight for light and justice, knowing that every day, every action counts in their quest for peace and understanding. After the soldier and his team had prevented a mass act of violence, peace was restored for a time. They continued their work to support the program, but the atmosphere was tense and wary. The soldier and his allies were recognized for their efforts, but many still felt that another crisis was imminent. One rainy evening, as the soldier was studying reports of new incidents of bias and racism, he received an anonymous letter. The envelope contained a photograph of a group of people standing in front of a building where important negotiations about the future of the program were taking place. One of the people was holding a sign with a hateful slogan that spoke of saving society from alien elements. The letter contained only one line: "They are going to act again, but this time not just as radicals, but as part of a larger plan. We know who it is, and you should know too." The soldier and his team, realizing that this signal could be important, began their investigation. They discovered that the organization behind this new manifestation of hatred had connections to high-profile politicians who had previously supported radical groups. Among them was a prominent public figure and politician who had publicly opposed the soldier program. Her public reputation was impeccable, but the information they had gathered pointed to her hidden ties to groups promoting racist and extremist ideologies. Suddenly, in the midst of the investigation, something unexpected happened. The politician and her associates announced plans for a major event where they intended to promote their ideas of national unity under the guise of preserving traditions. The event attracted public attention and promised to be a significant political event. The soldier, realizing that this could be a tipping point in the fight against bias, decided to take action. He organized a press conference where he revealed information about the hidden connections between politicians and radical groups, comparing it with facts and evidence. He also called on the public not to succumb to manipulation and not to allow political slogans to be used to spread hatred. The revelations created a real storm in society. The politician and her allies found themselves under fire, and public opinion began to change. But the situation did not remain calm. Protests and demonstrations became regular, and in some cases, they escalated into violent clashes. In the midst of the crisis, another unexpected event occurred. An explosion occurred at one of the major protests organized against the politics of hate. This explosion was directed against demonstrators supporting equality and justice. The victims were numerous, and this only exacerbated social tensions. The soldier, as before, found himself at the center of it all. Not only did he have to continue his work supporting the program, but he also had to contend with a new level of violence and fear. The investigation revealed that the bombing was orchestrated by a group that planned to use similar acts of violence to create chaos and increase their influence. Unraveling these complex connections, the soldier discovered an unexpected twist. It turned out that one of the key figures in a radical group that had previously been convicted was actually a frontman used as a distraction. The real brains of the group were among the political elites and businessmen who used their influence to create and maintain obscurantist ideologies. In his search for the truth, the soldier discovered that it was connected to a long-forgotten case of high-level corruption and manipulation. The politician who seemed to be the central figure in a hate movement was merely a pawn in a much more complex game. The soldier and his team began working to expose the entire network. Involving international bodies and independent investigations, they uncovered facts that several high-profile businessmen and politicians used radical groups as a tool of pressure and manipulation to maintain their influence and wealth. As the investigation continued, the soldier faced a new challenge. All efforts to expose the group led to him and his allies being persecuted. His life was again threatened, and even those who had previously supported him began to distance themselves out of fear. Despite all this, the soldier and his team continued to fight. Each new step in uncovering the scheme showed how deep the roots of racism and bias ran in society. They worked to make sure their fight would not be in vain, and that the truth about how high positions were used to promote hatred would be revealed. The soldier learned that in the fight for justice, it is not only victories that matter, but also the ability to stand firm in the face of the darkest and most dangerous challenges. He understood that true victory lies not only in achieving external goals, but also in overcoming one's internal fears and demons. The soldier's story continued to unfold, and his journey to combat bias and racism became more complex and dramatic. But he knew that every step, every revelation, and every victory mattered in the long-term fight for a more just world. And even in the shadow of betrayal and violence, the light of truth and humanity continued to illuminate his path. Despite the soldier and his team's tireless work to uncover the network of racist manipulators, their fight became even more intense. After the revelations of corruption and manipulation, public opinion was divided. Some supported the revelations, while others accused the soldier of trying to destabilize society. Incessant protests and counter-protests became commonplace, and the atmosphere in the country became tense. But just when things seemed to be reaching a fever pitch, an unexpected turn of events occurred. The soldier received information about an even larger operation being prepared, which was to take place in one of the country's largest metropolitan areas. Another act of violence was planned, which, according to the source, could cause a national catastrophe. As the soldier and his team worked to prevent another attack, they received information about a mysterious charity event, organized by a group previously considered to be pro-peace. The event attracted large crowds and received high media coverage. Officially, it was aimed at uniting disparate communities, but in recent days it has become clear that the goals may have been quite different. To find out what exactly was going on, the soldier decided to participate in the event undercover. He hoped to gain access to the group's internal plans and prevent possible attacks. The event, as expected, had an atmosphere of euphoria and well-being. People dressed in white, symbolizing unity, happily interacted with each other. However, to a soldier hidden among the crowd, it was clear that behind the good-natured facade lurked darker intentions. In the center of the event, the soldier noticed several high-profile individuals who had previously been associated with racist groups but now seemed completely transformed. They actively interacted with the participants, pretending to support the group. At one point, the soldier noticed them passing bags and packages to other participants, which aroused his suspicions. He began tracking the movements of these people and noticed that they were moving towards a closed area of the event. Once there, he saw bags and packages being placed in a secret storage area. Inside, he found explosive devices and numerous weapons components. While the soldier was trying to gather information and understand the scale of the threat, he noticed that he was being followed. As he was leaving the closed sector, he was caught in a trap. Several masked men grabbed him and took him to the underground rooms of the building. In this dungeon, the soldier found himself face to face with one of the high-profile organizers of the event. the man who was responsible for planning the bombings. This man seemed to be on the verge of a breakdown in rage. He explained that the event was nothing more than a ploy to bring as many people together as possible in one place, in order to then attack public order. "Everything you do," the organizers said, "is just fan the flames. We are creating conditions in which our ideology can survive. We are using fear to control people." The soldier managed to contact his allies, and they organized a rescue operation. Realizing that there was almost no time left, he managed to escape from the dungeon and transmitted information about the impending attack. When his allies arrived on the scene, they successfully prevented violence and arrested the organizers. However, this was only the beginning. It soon became clear that the organizers had connections not only with radical groups, but also with some important political figures, who used them to advance their own interests and undermine public order. The soldier and his team began to uncover even more complex patterns, showing how political manipulation and financial interests were intertwined with hate ideologies. These connections opened up new horizons for understanding how deeply biases ran in the social system. Meanwhile, despite their successes, the soldier felt deep personal pain. He realized that in his fight for justice, he had lost too much: loved ones, his sense of security, and, most painfully, his faith in the cause he fought for. The dark forces he had tried to defeat had left an indelible mark on his life. Yet despite all this, the soldier did not back down. He knew his work was not yet done. Internal and external conflicts continued to test his resolve, but he knew that every step toward exposing the dark forces and overcoming prejudice mattered. His story continued to unfold, and with each new discovery he came closer to understanding how to create lasting change. The path was rocky and filled with tragedy, but the soldier continued to fight for a more just world, knowing that each victory was another step toward the ultimate victory over hatred and prejudice. When the soldier and his team uncovered a massive conspiracy, it seemed that their efforts were finally paying off. The operation to prevent the bombings and the arrests of key organizers had a significant effect on public opinion. However, the joy of victory was overshadowed by a constant sense of anxiety and imminent danger. The dark forces they were trying to suppress were not left untouched. Violent reactions to the revelations and attacks on their lives began to manifest themselves with increasing frequency. Against the backdrop of political and social crises, the soldier faced a new personal challenge. His family, previously relatively safe, found itself the focus of those seeking revenge. One evening, as the soldier was returning home, he discovered that his apartment had been broken into. At first glance, nothing had been stolen, but he soon noticed strange signs and graffiti on the walls, threatening messages left by radical groups who promised more violence. Things quickly got worse when his younger brother, who also worked for the program, disappeared. He was last seen on his way home, and his absence was taken as a worrying sign. The soldier knew his brother could be a target for revenge because of their work, but even then, his fear and helplessness were indescribable. The investigation into his brother's disappearance dragged on, and despite all efforts, there were no results. In the midst of this tragedy, the soldier continued his work, but every day became a torment. He knew that his actions could have indirectly provoked an attack on his family, and guilt poisoned his thoughts. Things came to a head when another bomb exploded at a public event promoting equality. The attack killed several people, including one of the soldier's key allies. The tragedy sparked a new wave of public anger and further increased political pressure. But the greatest tragedy was yet to come. One cold winter day, the soldier received information from a trusted source that his brother had been found dead in an abandoned warehouse. It was the result of brutal violence, and the reason was obvious: revenge for the soldier's work and exposure. The loss of his brother broke the soldier. The tragedy, the death of a loved one, and the guilt that his work had led to the sacrifice became unbearable. His worldview changed. The fight for justice and equality no longer seemed as bright and hopeful as it once had. At this time, social tensions reached their peak. Political manipulations associated with racist ideologies and violence continued to sow chaos. And even after all the revelations, radical groups retained their influence. The soldier's internal state worsened. He became increasingly isolated, and his fight for justice seemed endless. His team, sensing his deep despair and pain, supported him, but they also realized that the pressure and constant threats made his fight even more difficult. One night, while he was working in his office, he discovered that his computer had been hacked. All data on ongoing investigations and plans had been stolen. This meant that radical groups could gain access to critical information and possibly launch further attacks. The soldier was in complete despair. He knew that all his efforts could be in vain if the data fell into the wrong hands. He was also aware that even if he continued his work, the results could be destroyed by further attacks. Meanwhile, a political crisis erupted in the country. The opposition and radical elements used the events and explosions to undermine public order and spark new unrest. The situation became so tense that it seemed the country was on the brink of civil war. In this chaotic environment, the soldier gathered what was left of his strength and determination to continue the fight. He knew that every moment was critical. His team supported him despite the personal tragedies and crises they faced. They were able to conduct additional investigations and implement new security measures, but their work was far from finished. Ultimately, after intense and difficult work, the soldier and his team were able to prevent a series of new attacks and ensure the safety of many people. They exposed new schemes of radical groups and helped law enforcement agencies arrest those responsible for the latest attacks. Yet despite the successes he had achieved, the soldier's personal tragedy remained with him. He knew that his work had brought loss and pain, and that he would continue to carry those memories throughout his life. The soldier continued his fight for justice and equality despite personal losses and external threats. He understood that true victory does not always lie in the final triumph, but in the continuous struggle for a brighter future. Despite all the tragedies and obstacles, his story became a symbol of resilience and courage, demonstrating that even in the darkest times, humanity and determination can overcome the darkest forces. After the tragedies and brutal trials the soldier had endured, he regained his focus on his mission. Despite all the devastation and personal loss, his resolve to fight racism and prejudice remained unwavering, but as public attention began to focus again on solving social problems, the soldier made a shocking discovery that changed the course of his work. After analyzing new data and information, he discovered that sooner or later radical groups and their supporters not only manipulate society, but also infiltrate the highest echelons of power. At the same time, he began to receive anonymous messages that among his allies and colleagues there may be informants working for radical groups. One of these messages was a scanned document with a cryptic note that showed that one of the key figures in the program to support equality and combat racism had dubious connections. This information was difficult to verify and left the soldier deeply suspicious. Soon, an unexpected turn of events occurred. During a routine meeting with important program partners, the soldier witnessed a trusted colleague working on the anti-bias program begin to act strangely. His manner of communication changed, and he began to avoid answering questions directly. The soldier decided to conduct an undercover investigation. He checked the available data and found evidence indicating that this colleague was collaborating with an influential group that had previously been associated with radical and racist ideas. This discovery was shocking and disorienting for the soldier, who had always considered this man a friend and ally. When he confronted the colleague, he did not deny his connection, but explained it in a shocking way. The colleague revealed that he had been caught in the middle of a complex game of double agents and manipulators. He had been recruited by radical groups who used threats and blackmail to force him to work for them under duress. The colleague explained that they were using him to sabotage the program from within and that he felt trapped with no way out. The soldier, realizing that the betrayal was part of a larger plan, began working with this colleague to expose the entire network. During the investigation, he discovered that radical groups were not just controlling people, but were actively influencing political decisions, creating social unrest and division to achieve their goals. The turn of events reached its climax when one of the radical leaders, previously thought to have disappeared, appeared in public with an open statement. He accused the soldiers' program of being part of a conspiracy aimed at destroying traditional values. His statement received wide media coverage and caused a public outcry. Together with his fellow saboteur, the soldier continued to uncover hidden connections between radical groups and influential politicians and businessmen. They managed to establish that they were using public discontent and fear to push the country into new political and social crises. However, tensions and pressure continued to mount. There was a threat of new violence aimed at discrediting the program and its support. To prevent this, the soldier and his team organized a complex operation to expose and eliminate radical cells. The operation was successful, and many key figures in the radical groups were arrested, but it also led to a new crisis. Authorities that had previously supported the program began to distance themselves from it, fearing accusations of links to radical elements. This weakened the program's position and created a new wave of public doubt. The soldier and his team faced another challenge: rebuilding public trust and continuing the fight for justice in the face of increased political pressure. They began to push for reform and education, knowing that their work was not yet done. The soldier's story took on new shades of drama and tragedy. Personal betrayal and the revelation of complex political schemes once again confirmed how deeply rooted racism and prejudice are, but his resilience and determination to continue the fight became a symbol of hope and courage. And even in the shadow of betrayal and crisis, the soldier continued to believe in the possibility of change. His story became a testimony to the fact that in the fight for justice and equality, it is necessary not only to reveal the dark sides, but also to work tirelessly to create a better future. After exposing radical groups and attempting to restore public trust, the soldier faced a new level of struggle. Although many of the leading radicals had been arrested and plans to destabilize society had been thwarted, the effects of their actions continued to be felt. The soldier and his team found themselves at the center of a new crisis. Over time, the soldier noticed that new ideas and initiatives aimed at combating racism and bias were facing serious difficulties. Popular radical narratives began to spread again on the internet and social media, creating polarization and reinforcing old stereotypes. As if tired and exhausted by the endless cycle of violence and betrayal, society began to lean towards more radical and divisive opinions. The soldier's personal stress had also reached its breaking point. The death of his brother and the betrayal of a colleague had left deep wounds, and he often suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. His relationships with loved ones and allies began to suffer, and even the simplest joys seemed unattainable. One evening, as the soldier was returning home, he received a message from an unknown source. It was an invitation to a meeting in an abandoned building. The source claimed to have important information about the radical group's future plans. Despite his fear and doubts, the soldier felt that this could be a chance to find new evidence and expose hidden threats. The meeting turned out to be a trap. The soldier found himself surrounded by aggressive radicals who seemed to know about his plans and intentions. They began to threaten him and use the information they had previously received from his betrayed colleague. The soldier had to use all his skills to get out of this situation alive, but he still suffered some injuries. Despite the trauma and shock, the soldier continued to seek ways to combat the growing racism and bias. He assembled a team of trusted people, and they decided to continue the work, creating new strategies and programs for educational initiatives and social change. But the drama and tragedy continued to haunt him. Over time, it became clear that radical groups had begun using new tactics. They were infiltrating civil society organizations, mainstream media, and even government structures. Amid this internal crisis, one of the major politicians who had publicly condemned radicalism found himself associated with these groups, causing even more public panic and mistrust. At the same time, the soldier discovered that radical groups were preparing an even larger attack on the equality program. An operation that would take place on a national level could destroy all his efforts and cause an even greater wave of violence and disintegration. The implementation of the new strategy proved extremely difficult. The soldier and his team worked day and night to prevent the attack. They used all available resources, collected evidence, and collaborated with international organizations and law enforcement agencies. In the midst of this operation, another tragic event occurred. During one of the protests organized against racist groups, an explosion occurred, resulting in the death of many people, including some members of the soldiers' team. This act of violence was aimed at undermining their work and destroying the credibility of their efforts. This explosion caused deep emotional trauma to the soldier. He felt that his actions had led to even more suffering and casualties. His inner conflict and guilt deepened. He began to doubt whether his decisions were correct, and his faith in the ultimate victory was undermined. During this time, the soldier decided to take a personal step toward reconciliation and healing. He sought help from a therapist and began working to restore his emotional and mental strength. He also reached out to his community, organizing meetings and dialogues with victims of violence to help them cope with grief and restore hope. Gradually, despite all the suffering and loss, the soldier began to believe in the possibility of change again. He continued his work, but with a new perspective, based on greater attention to human stories and emotions, not just strategies and politics. He used his experiences to inspire others and create space for healing and understanding. The soldier's story, filled with drama and tragedy, continued to evolve. He became a symbol not only of the fight for justice, but also of the ability to overcome personal trials and find light even in the darkest corners of life. His journey, despite all the difficulties, became a testament to the strength of the human spirit and resilience in the fight for a brighter future. After the soldier survived the tragic events and continued his work, the situation in the country remained tense. His personal losses and challenges led to profound internal changes. He realized that his fight not only against radical groups but also for internal understanding and healing was an important part of the path to justice. Meanwhile, public unrest was growing in the country. Growing discontent and tensions, fueled by both radical groups and unintentional government mistakes, led to new protests and violence. The public palate was saturated with contradictions, and the path to unity seemed increasingly difficult to achieve. At this time, the soldier received information about a new, deeply encrypted plot. According to the source, radical groups were planning a large-scale campaign to undermine social harmony by manipulating public opinion and falsifying important information. They were going to use false documents and doctored video footage to create the false impression of increased violence by certain ethnic groups, which could lead to further acts of racist violence. At this point, the soldier also witnessed a surprising and tragic event. One of the local communities that had long been subject to prejudice and violence was suddenly under attack. The attackers used fake documents and false messages to make it appear that the group was planning to attack other communities. The public reaction was violent, and new acts of violence began to erupt across the country. The soldier and his team launched an urgent investigation to expose the fake evidence and prevent further violence. Working with data analysts, security experts and journalists, they began tracking the sources of the fake material and identifying the people behind the plot. While the soldier and his team tried to expose the manipulators, personal trials continued to impact his life. One of the most difficult moments was confronting his own past. He discovered that his family had old ties to an organization that had once supported racist ideas. These ties had long been severed, but their existence became another source of internal conflict and self-examination for the soldier. In addition, his personal relationships began to suffer. The constant pressure and stress of work, as well as his own internal state, led to a breakdown in relationships with loved ones. In moments of deep fatigue and despair, he often wondered whether this endless struggle was worth continuing. The uncertainty and fear reached their peak one evening when a soldier and his team received information about an impending attack on a key public forum devoted to the discussion of race and justice. This attack would destroy any credibility of the program and trigger a new wave of violence. The soldier and his team organized an operation to prevent the attack. They actively cooperated with local law enforcement and used their resources to ensure the security of the forum. In the midst of the event, they received disturbing news that there was a traitor in their team. The traitor was a close member of the team who had been working for radical groups for a long time under heavy pressure. He was passing on information about the plans of the soldier and his team, which jeopardized their efforts. By the time the traitor was exposed, the attack was already underway. The soldier, sensing that his work was about to be destroyed, decided to take decisive action. He organized the evacuation of the forum participants while simultaneously working to apprehend the traitor. The operation was successful in that they were able to prevent the attack, but the traitor managed to escape and left behind a trail of destruction and loss. The forum, though safe, was marred by internal conflicts and broken bonds. The soldier and his team felt that their struggle had reached a new stage, where dangers came not only from external enemies, but also from those who were close to them. The internal conflict became even more complex to resolve. Over time, the soldier realized that he needed to not only fight external threats, but also work to restore trust and unity within his environment. He began to conduct deeper therapy sessions and share his experiences with colleagues to create a space for mutual understanding and support. Despite all the hardships and tragedies, the soldier and his team continued to work towards a more just society. They used their stories to inspire others and raise important questions about racism, bias, and internal conflict. And while the road to change was long and difficult, the soldier and his team knew that every step, every revelation, and every effort to rebuild trust were important parts of their fight. Their story continued to evolve, and each new challenge was part of their quest for justice and equality. The soldier and his team had endured many hardships, and although their fight for justice and equality was far from over, they were beginning to see signs of progress. However, each step forward was accompanied by new challenges and threats. Shortly after foiling the attack on the forum, the soldier discovered that radical groups had begun using new tactics to undermine their work. They began spreading false rumors and false accusations through popular social media and media. These manipulations created an image in the public mind of the soldier and his team as traitors and agents of outside interference. Their efforts to expose racism and bias were now being questioned and criticized. Against the backdrop of this public pressure, a political crisis erupted in the country. The heightened political struggle led to new accusations and investigations that concerned not only radical groups, but also the program itself that the soldier supported. Politicians, seeking to take advantage of the situation, began to use any means to discredit their opponents. Then the soldier got another unexpected turn. One of his old acquaintances, who worked in high circles of government structures, contacted him and offered important information. This acquaintance told about a secret plan that radical groups had developed to gain control over key political and media posts. They planned to use their influence to create chaos and political manipulation in the upcoming elections. With this information, the soldier and his team began an investigation to expose the plan and prevent it from being carried out. However, their actions attracted the attention of high-profile supporters of radical groups, who began to harass them. This threat became especially serious when attempts at bribery and blackmail began to undermine the team. The soldier, exhausted by constant threats and internal conflicts, realized that he was on the brink of another personal test. In the midst of this crisis, he was faced with a new blow. One of his closest colleagues and friends was involved in a conspiracy. This man, whom the soldier considered an ally, turned out to be an undercover agent of radical groups. When this traitor was revealed, it caused deep emotional trauma for the soldier. Not only did he experience betrayal, but he also saw his efforts undermined time and time again by destructive forces. In parallel, his personal life continued to suffer, and his relationships with family and friends became increasingly strained. However, the soldier did not allow these tragedies to break him. Internal conflict and doubt gave him a new perspective on his mission. He decided to use his personal trials as a means to gain a deeper understanding of racism and bias. Instead of focusing solely on external threats, he began holding internal workshops and group discussions to analyze and address issues of bias and self-destruction within the movement itself. These internal efforts have allowed the team to become more cohesive and decisive. They have become more mindful of their internal environment and have been able to prevent several potential crises. The team has also launched new education and outreach initiatives aimed at overcoming bias and sparking dialogue. Despite this, radical groups continue to try to undermine the team's work. A key moment came when they learned of plans for another major attack, this time at an international human rights conference that was supposed to be a landmark event for their program. The soldier and his team worked quickly to prevent the attack. They worked with international organizations and security services to ensure the conference was protected. In preparation, they discovered that radical groups were planning to use the media to create the false impression of violent actions on behalf of those who were actually fighting for peace. The conference was a success and the attack was thwarted, but the job was far from done. As a result of all this fighting, the soldier and his team realized that their job required not only fighting external threats, but also creating a deeper and more comprehensive understanding and cooperation at the societal level. They continued their efforts despite the difficulties and began to see positive changes. Their work in education and outreach began to bear fruit. Society began to discuss issues of racism and bias more actively, and some radical groups began to lose influence. However, for the soldier and his team, it was a continuous journey of struggle and overcoming. Each success was met with new challenges, and personal trials continued to impact their lives. But their resilience and determination to stay on the path to justice became an inspiration to many. The soldier's story continued to evolve, each new stage a part of their quest to create a more just and equal society. Within these efforts were moments of hope and moments of deep personal and societal crisis. And though the struggle was far from over, the soldier and his team continued to move forward, determined to make positive changes and to create a better future. After months of struggle, drama, and personal trials, the soldier and his team began to see the results of their efforts. Their determination and dedication, despite numerous difficulties, began to bear fruit. With the help of international organizations and human rights groups, they managed to create a support network for victims of racism and bias. Thanks to their initiatives and efforts, a large-scale education and awareness program was launched, covering schools, universities, and workplaces. This program focused on overcoming stereotypes, strengthening intercultural dialogue, and creating a space for constructive discussion and resolution of racism. In addition, the soldier and his team achieved the adoption of new legislative initiatives aimed at combating discrimination and promoting equality. These changes began to have a positive impact on public life, contributing to the creation of a more inclusive and fair society. In the wake of these successes, a significant event occurred. The soldier was invited to an international human rights conference to share his story and experiences. His presentation was met with great enthusiasm and support, and many participants expressed gratitude for his tireless efforts in the fight against racism. At this point, despite all his previous suffering, the soldier felt that his efforts were finally making a real difference. He saw society beginning to change for the better, and this gave him new hope. His personal life also began to recover. After much effort, he was able to rebuild relationships with his family and friends. The support and love of his loved ones became an important part of his recovery and emotional healing. The soldier and his team continued their work, but now they could do so with a new sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. They saw how their efforts were beginning to make a real difference, and this gave them the strength to continue. Eventually, the soldier found his place in a new world that was beginning to be built on the basis of understanding, equality, and justice. His story became an inspiration to many people, and his personal journey from struggle to victory showed that even in the darkest times, light and hope can be found. And while the work to overcome racism and bias continued, the soldier and his team could look to the future with confidence and optimism. They knew that their efforts and struggles had not been in vain, and that every step toward a better world was a valuable contribution to the common good. The soldier's story ended on a positive note, but he understood that the path to justice is not an end goal, but a constant striving for improvement. His legacy lives on in every person who can see hope in his struggle and inspiration to continue working toward a more just and equal society. What do you think of our story? We really want to hear your opinion. Please write in the comments what you liked or what you would like to see in the future. We are also interested in how long you have been following our channel. Share in the comments how long you have been with us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell to stay up to date with all new videos and updates. Thank you for your support, and we wish you all the best.